Hey there, DGSA and P. Let's go over some details of brain organization. Looking at the brain, I need you to understand that there is gray matter and white matter. In the spinal cord, the gray matter is central. It's this butterfly H thing. And of course, there is going to be gray matter that is going to line the central cavity of the more superior regions of the spinal cord. And then inside the brain itself, we're going to start to see what are called ventricles, or spaces inside the brain. And there's going to be gray matter that lines those spaces. But there's also going to be superficial or cortical gray matter covering the surface of the cerebrum. Nuclei that are found in the spinal cord and in the brain itself. There are some places where some of the cranial nerves originate in the brainstem and are really important centers in the brain as well. That's going to be where there are some cell bodies and where sometimes the origination of action potentials that are going to run out of those cranial nerves are going to come from. When we look at the brainstem itself, there are three main parts: the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain, named inferiorly to superficially. As we look at this, what this is just basically a passageway for all of the signals to and from the spinal cord and the brain. The medulla of the brainstem is really important. It's going to regulate some basic physiological functions, including those you see here. Perhaps you've also heard that the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body and vice versa. This is because there is this anatomical feature called decussation of the pyramids. On the next slide, I'll show you what that means. Cranial nerves 8 through 12 attached to the medulla. Back to the idea of decussation of the pyramids. Many of the tracts that are coming up from or descending down through the spinal cord, and what you're looking at here is the medulla, sort of the interior of the medulla, if you will. There are these structures called the pyramids, and what happens is these tracts cross over left to right and right to left, and this is why a large portion of the right side of your body is controlled by the left side of your brain and vice versa. That is the site of the decussation of the pyramids. Don't confuse this word decussation with desiccation. Decussation is different than decussation. The pons is known as the bridge. All right, this is a bridge between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. It is a bridge between the cerebrum and the medulla, and it's going to carry signals up to the thalamus. And the thalamus is the relay station of the brain, where signals that originate from the brain or originate from the spinal cord are relayed from one of those structures to the other. The pons bridges the right and left hemispheres of the cerebellum as well, and this is the attachment point of cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8. The midbrain is sometimes referred to as the reptilian center of your brain. Four critical structures of the midbrain are the superior, the left and right, and the inferior colliculi. This is also known as the corpora quadrigeminae. When you have all of a sudden reflex response to some sound, the inferior colliculi are firing in your brain and making your body jump. And if you see something all of a sudden, like a bad monster jumping out at you in a movie, for example, and you have a sudden visual stimulus, the superior colliculi are firing and causing your autonomic sympathetic division of your autonomic nervous system to start to ramp up and get you ready to be all running away or fighting for your life. The midbrain is the attachment point for cranial nerves 3 and 4. The diencephalon is really the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and I'll give you some information here about those parts. The thalamus is most of the diencephalon. This is what I was referring to earlier as the relay station. Sort of the decision point of whether or not signals coming up from the spinal cord actually get relayed to the cerebrum or vice versa, stuff from the cerebrum down to the spinal cord. It's sort of like a decision-making point. So there's going to be a lot of synapses here between nerve tracts from the spinal cord up to the cerebrum, and then there's synapses from nerves that are in the cerebrum that would synapse with the nerves that are down in efferent signaling, descending pathways down into the spinal cord. The hypothalamus is the region of the brain that's really an endocrine structure. Obviously, it's nervous tissue, but it's an endocrine structure as well. A lot of the really important hormones that are produced that control a lot of your body's functions are going to be produced here and then ultimately released by way of the pituitary gland into the bloodstream for further distribution throughout the body. Other parts of the diencephalon that are named are the epithalamus and the subthalamus. The epithalamus is technically where the pineal gland is that's producing the hormone melatonin. That's the one that makes you sleepy. The choroid plexuses, there are a number of them in the brain, and there's one key one right up here. The choroid plexuses are the areas where cerebrospinal fluid is being produced. And essentially, cerebrospinal fluid, as indicated here, is a filtrate of blood. So these membranes of these cells, these are cells that make up the capillaries, and these ependymal glial cells, their membranes serve as a filter. And so large things like, cells, like red blood cells or white blood cells, what have you, platelets, large protein molecules, they cannot cross through this membrane, but smaller particles such as sugar and oxygen molecules and vitamins and necessary ions can. The nerves of the brain produce waste, and that's got to be circulated away from those structures, and so the cerebrospinal fluid serves as a mechanism to take waste particles away from the brain and then get it into the blood so that then those waste particles can be excreted from your body either by the way of your lungs or your kidneys. The cerebrum is, when you look at the cerebrum, this is most of what you see when you're seeing a brain. It's the most superior region. It's that wrinkly sort of mushroom cap on top of the rest of the brain. And this is where the higher functionings of your cognition are occurring. So your awareness of yourself, where you initiate and control the movements of your body. This is where your memories are formed, where you learn and how you communicate. This is really sort of the highest functioning executive suite, if you will, of your brain. This is a slide that's going to tell you what a sulci is versus a gyri. These are plural forms. The singular is sulcus. The singular on this word is gyrus. And then we have some significant sulcus and fissures here that I want you to know about. So you can pause this and write those down and know where they are and know what they're separating. I like this slide because it's a frontal or coronal section of the cerebrum of the brain, and you can see the superficial cortical gray matter, and you can see the white matter that's interior, and another obvious structure that crosses and connects the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum is called the corpus callosum. This is part of what's referred to as the superhighway of connections between right and left, and it's thought that epileptic seizures are often the result of hypercommunication between the right and left hemispheres. And so one of the early treatments for seizures is to actually surgically cut the corpus callosum. This is the so-called split brain concept. And that did alleviate, or it does alleviate some seizure problems, but it causes some other issues as well. For the most part these days, seizures are controlled with medication and pharmaceutical treatments. When you look at the cerebrum, the lobes or the regions of the brain are generally named for the bones that overlie those regions, such as the case with the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe here. This is a slide that you ought to spend some time with, because what it does is it's showing you not only the name of these different lobes, but what the function of these lobes are. I think it's important to point out that the central sulcus here, which is this groove, this separates the frontal from the parietal lobe, and you should know that the frontal lobe is a primary motor area. So when you decide to move your arm, this region of the frontal lobe is going to initiate some action potentials that will eventually travel through the brainstem and down your spinal cord to the muscles of your arm and cause movements in your arm. When you sense something in your arm, back here, post-central gyrus, which is after the central sulcus here, or posterior to it, this is where feeling or sensation in your arm would be interpreted in your brain. You can see that the occipital lobe is primarily the visual area. The temporal lobe is associated with hearing or auditory processing, and also even speech. Okay? If you look at what proportion of the brain is devoted to controlling or sensing different portions of the body, it's not proportionate. Look how big the hand and fingers and thumbs are, and look how big the lips and tongue are, right? And look how small the knee and the legs are, right? So a disproportionate area of our brain is controlling or sensing our hands and our fingers and our noses and our lips and our tongue. And if you look at what the size of the body would be if the same proportion of the brain were equal to the proportion or body size of your body parts, your hands would be huge, right? Your mouth and tongue would be huge. What this tells you is that the control of those areas of the brain is very the control of those, the control of the areas of the body that are drawn large here is very precise, and the sensation is very precise as well. The cerebellum is the part of the body that's really smoothing out and coordinating the movement of your body, and it's really important for actually keeping your body movements sort of not jerky and out of control. If you look at the interior of the cerebellum, you're going to see the gray matter and white matter organization, and the white matter of this cerebellum looks kind of like a tree, and literally it's referred to as arbor vitae, which means tree and life. And we actually name some plants that many people use as screening on the edge of their property lines called arbor vitae. They're these evergreen flat needle type plants. If you look at the pattern of these needles and how they're shaped, it looks really similar to the pattern and shape and structure of the white matter inside the cerebellum. The next few slides here are just information about the cranial nerves. I'm sort of expecting that you know which cranial nerves are what at this point. And, you know, these are your memory mnemonics to help you remember the names. O, to touch and feel very good. Velvet, heaven. The first letters of those words correlate with the first letter of the names of the cranial nerves. And then this memory mnemonic, some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter most. The first letters of those words will indicate to you these cranial nerves, 1 through 12, whether they are sensory neurons, sensory nerves, motor nerves, or perhaps both, as the case may be. This is just a comprehensive slide that tells you a little bit about those cranial nerves, what they are, what they do, where they're going to, and where they're coming from. So that's it for this recording. Hopefully that helped you, ladies and gentlemen.